The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when Mara Ellison signed them. She didn't cry. That surprised everyone in the room, the attorney, the notary, even Daniel, who sat across the polished conference table watching her like a man waiting for a storm that never came. She simply pressed the pen to the paper, finished her signature in the same careful cursive she'd used since the 7th grade, and slid the documents back across the table without looking up. Outside, it was February. The kind of February that doesn't just feel cold, it feels deliberate, like the world has decided to make you feel every degree of it. She walked to her car alone. The parking garage was empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a car alarm 3 floors above. She sat behind the wheel for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the dashboard the way a drowning person watches the surface of the water above them, not because they believe they'll reach it, but because they need something to focus on. Then she made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not one born of rage or revenge or the movie version of Heartbreak that comes with smashed dishes and shouted ultimatums. Just a quiet, cellular decision. I am going to disappear. And she did. To understand why disappearing felt like the only rational option, you have to understand what the 3 years before the divorce had actually cost her. Mara had married Daniel Ellison at 29, which felt, at the time, like arriving at something she'd been running toward her whole life. He was clever and charming in the way that certain men are, the kind of charming that looks like warmth from a distance but is actually performance, carefully rehearsed and strategically deployed. She was a landscape architect with her own small firm, a leased studio downtown, a handful of loyal clients, and a reputation she'd spent nearly a decade building stitch by careful stitch. By the 2nd year of their marriage, the firm was gone. Not because she failed at her work. Because she trusted the wrong person with the business finances. Because she believed Daniel when he said he'd handle the accounting side, so she could focus on what she loved. By the time she discovered that he'd been siphoning client retainers into a separate account, money meant for subcontractors. For materials, for permits, the damage was already total. 3 clients had sued. Her license was under review. Her name, which she'd spent years making synonymous with integrity and vision, had become a punchline in the local professional community. The worst part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the professional ruin. It was that he had told people, mutual friends, her own sister, that she had done it. That she had made the financial errors. That he had tried to warn her. He told the story with such rehearsed sadness, such apparent reluctance, that people believed him. Because why wouldn't they? He was Daniel. He was the steady one, the practical one, the one who always seemed to have his feet on the ground while Mara, creative, emotional Mara, had her head somewhere in the clouds. She lost the firm. She lost the friendships. She lost her sister's trust for almost 8 months. She lost 20 pounds she didn't have to lose and gained a resting tremor in her left hand that her doctor said was stress-related and would pass. It did not pass. After the divorce, she went back to her apartment, the one she'd moved into during the separation. A ground-floor unit near a bus depot that smelled faintly of exhaust and old carpet, and she sat on the floor of the empty living room with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest. And she thought, what is left of me? The answer felt dangerously close to nothing. She had savings enough for maybe 4 months. She had no active clients, no studio, no equipment beyond what fit in the back of her 7-year-old Subaru. She had a professional reputation that would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. She had a sister who was beginning to come back around, slowly, the way people return from embarrassment, in small gestures, in texts that said nothing but meant I'm still here. And she had a memory. A single, specific memory that kept surfacing during those first brutal weeks. Her grandmother's property. Mara's grandmother, Rosalind, a woman who had outlasted 2 husbands, 1 house fire, and a brief but passionate phase as a competitive ceramicist, had died 4 years earlier. leaving behind a peculiar asset that no one in the family quite knew what to do with. It was a small property in the hill country north of the city. 7 acres, mostly scrubland and limestone, and at its edge, where the land dropped away into an old quarry that had been out of commercial operation since the 1980s, there was a cabin. Cabin was generous. It was more accurately described as a structure: 2 rooms, a sleeping loft, a wood stove, a hand pump connected to a deep-drilled well that, according to the property records, still functioned. No internet connection. No central heat. Electricity only from a solar array that Rosalind had installed herself at the age of 73 because, in her words, she wasn't going to spend her final years dependent on a power company that couldn't survive a thunderstorm. The family had left it sitting. Mara's mother didn't want it. Her sister had no use for it. It had been mentioned, vaguely, as something they'd eventually sell, but there was a boundary dispute with an adjacent landowner that had never been resolved. And so it sat in a kind of legal holding pattern, belonging to no one in particular. Mara had visited it once, when she was 11, during a summer when Rosalind had briefly entertained the idea of making it a proper retreat. She remembered the quarry most vividly, the way the limestone walls dropped into still, blue-green water that looked artificial, like someone had filled a wound in the earth with something beautiful. She remembered standing at the edge and feeling simultaneously terrified and completely at peace. She called her mother from the apartment floor. "Can I use the cabin? Rosalind's place?" A pause. "Mara, that place has been sitting empty for 4 years. It's probably falling apart." "I know. You can't work from there. There's no internet." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. Her mother, to her credit, was a woman who had raised 2 daughters largely alone and had developed, over decades, a finely tuned instinct for when the situation called for questions and when it called for yes. "Take the spare key from the lockbox. The code is Grandma's birthday." Mara packed her car in 2 hours. She didn't tell anyone where she was going except her mother, and she asked her mother not to share it. She drove north as the sun went down, through the city and through its suburbs, through the small towns that exist on the edges of maps. Through the cedar-thick hills where the roads get narrow and the cell signal gets thin. Until she turned onto an unmarked gravel road and followed it for 2 miles until it ended at a rusted cattle gate. She pushed it open. She drove through. She didn't look back. The cabin, when she reached it in the dark, was exactly as falling apart as her mother had predicted. 3 shingles missing from the roof. A window in the loft cracked along one corner. Mouse droppings on the kitchen shelf. The wood stove clogged with debris from some bird that had nested in the flue. The hand pump seized from years of disuse. She sat on the porch step with a flashlight and looked out at the shape of the quarry in the dark, just an absence in the land, a place where the earth stopped and something else began. She thought, "This is either the worst idea I've ever had or the only idea I've ever had that was truly mine." She chose to believe the second thing. The first month nearly broke her in a different way than Daniel had. The pump took her 4 days to free. She watched tutorial videos on her phone while she still had enough signal, took notes in a pocket notebook with a mechanical pencil, and worked on it in the mornings when the light was good. When the water finally came, brown at first, then clearing to a cold, mineral-clean transparency, she stood at the kitchen sink and laughed out loud for the first time in months. It wasn't a joyful laugh, exactly. It was the sound of something that had been clenched slowly releasing. The roof she patched imperfectly with materials she drove 40 minutes to a small hardware store to buy, watching YouTube videos in the parking lot before she attempted each step. The patch leaked in the second week when a 3-day rain came through. She spent those 3 days with buckets arranged under the drips and a growing, crawling anxiety that whispered, "You cannot do this. You were never the kind of person who could do this." She repaired the patch. It held. But the physical challenges were, in some ways, the easier ones. The silence was not peaceful at first. The silence was an interrogation. Without the noise of the city, without the constant friction of other people's needs, other people's schedules. The phone calls and emails and social texting that had formed the scaffolding of her daily life, she was left alone with herself in a way that felt almost unbearable. She had spent 3 years in a marriage that required her to be constantly vigilant, constantly reading the room, constantly managing Daniel's moods and narratives and needs. She had forgotten, somewhere in those 3 years, what her own thoughts actually sounded like when no one else's were pressing against them. What she found, in that silence, wasn't peaceful. It was grief. Raw, specific, and relentless. She grieved the firm. She grieved the version of herself that had believed in Daniel with such complete and humiliating conviction. She grieved the friendships she'd lost, particularly Elena, her closest friend since college, who had chosen to believe Daniel's version of events and had sent Mara exactly one text since the divorce. A 2-sentence expression of sympathy that read more like a formal condolence than a friendship. She grieved the children she hadn't had yet, which felt strange to grieve because they were hypothetical, but grief is rarely logical. There were nights she lay in the sleeping loft listening to the wind move through the cedars and the occasional echo from the quarry. Sound traveled strangely across that water, brought distant things close, and she felt so fundamentally alone that it seemed less like an emotional state and more like a physical condition, like low blood pressure or a broken bone. She cried. She cried more than she had expected to and less elegantly than she'd have liked. And then, slowly, she began to work. It started because she needed something to do with her hands. She had brought her sketchbooks, old ones, from before the firm. From the period in her late 20s when she'd worked for a landscape design company and had filled book after book with observations, ideas, plant studies, spatial concepts that had never been built. She found them at the bottom of a box and sat on the porch with them one morning in the thin March sun and began to draw. Not project drawings. Not client proposals. Just the quarry. She drew it from every angle she could safely access. She drew the way the water changed color through the day, blue-gray at dawn, almost green at noon, copper-edged at sunset. She drew the plant life that had colonized the quarry walls over 40 years of abandonment, the stubborn cedar saplings pushing from limestone cracks, the moss in low, patient colonies. The wild grapevines that had begun to thread down the sheer faces of stone in a way that was both chaotic and, if you looked long enough, deeply ordered. She began to see it differently. What had been cut from the earth, violently, commercially, with no regard for what the land wanted, had, over 4 decades of neglect, been reclaimed. The wound had become a habitat. The scar had become a world. She stared at it for a long time one afternoon, her pencil still, and thought, that's it. That's exactly what I'm doing here. It happened in late May, 3.5 months after she arrived. She had begun, by then, to find a rhythm, the kind of rhythm that is not imposed from the outside but grows from the inside, like something biological. She woke early, worked on the cabin's continuing repairs through the morning, sketched or read through the afternoon, and spent the evenings on the porch watching the light leave the quarry. She had also, quietly and without any grand announcement, begun drafting a proposal. It had started as pure exercise, something to keep her professional mind from atrophying. A conceptual landscape plan for the quarry and its surrounding 7 acres. What would it look like, she wondered, if someone tried to restore this space? Not restore it to what it had been before the quarrying, that was impossible, but work with what the land had become? Honor the abandonment? Design around the wound rather than trying to erase it? She had no client. She had no commission. She had no professional standing to speak of. But she had 3 months of daily observation, hundreds of sketches, a growing library of notes on the existing plant ecology, and something she hadn't had in years, work that felt entirely, frighteningly hers. She sent the proposal to a single person, Dr. Ines Carrasco, a landscape ecologist she had met once at a conference 6 years ago and had admired from a cautious distance. She sent it on a Wednesday morning, from the hardware store parking lot where she could access the internet on her phone, with a subject line that said, "Quarry Restoration Concept, an unsolicited proposal from someone who has been living next to one." She expected nothing. She drove back to the cabin and told herself firmly that she had expected nothing. Dr. Carrasco replied in 4 days. The reply was 2 pages long. It used phrases like, "genuinely remarkable ecological sensitivity," and "spatial narrative I haven't seen approached this way before," and, at the end, asked a single question. "Would you be willing to meet?" Mara read the email 3 times in the parking lot. Then she drove back to the cabin, sat on the porch step, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, to feel something that wasn't grief or determination or controlled, functional resilience. She felt hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply sits down next to you and says, "I've been here the whole time. You just couldn't hear me." The meeting with Dr. Carrasco led, over the following months, to an introduction to a land conservation nonprofit that had been seeking a designer with exactly the kind of ecological integration approach Mara had developed not in a studio or a classroom, but on a porch, with a pencil and a quarry and 4 months of uninterrupted attention. She began consulting remotely. Then she began taking on small projects. The work was slow and the income modest, but it was real, and it was hers in a way that nothing had been since before Daniel. Her hands stopped trembling. She noticed that on a Tuesday afternoon in August, washing dishes at the repaired hand pump. She looked at her left hand and it was simply still. She stood there for almost a full minute, watching it. By September, she had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like a modest and unconventional life. A conservation consultant working remotely from a repaired cabin on a quarry property in the hill country. She drove to town twice a week. She video-called her mother on Sundays. She and her sister had rebuilt something careful and honest between them, not the old relationship, which had had a fragility to it she could now recognize in retrospect, but something newer and more deliberately constructed. She did not date. She did not particularly want to. What she found she wanted, after the months of silence had taught her to hear herself, was solitude, not the desperate loneliness of the early weeks, but the chosen, curated version of it. The kind that feels like a room you've made comfortable rather than a room you've been locked in. She began to understand things about herself that the marriage, and the years of performing competence and stability while Daniel quietly dismantled everything around her, had obscured. She understood that she was not, as she had long believed, someone who needed external validation to feel confident in her work. She had believed this because Daniel had told her so, often, in the disguised language of concern. "You care too much about what people think, Mara, you should hear this from someone who loves you." It turned out this was wrong. The quarry proposal had been made in complete isolation, with no audience, no feedback loop, no possibility of approval. And it had been the best work she'd ever done. She understood that she had a high tolerance for discomfort that she had never been allowed to discover because there had always been something comfortable available, comfort that, she now saw, had often come attached to cost. She understood that grief, fully allowed and not medicated or distracted or rushed, does not consume you. It passes through you. It changes the texture of things, permanently and not entirely badly, the way water changes stone. She also understood that she was not finished being angry. This surprised her. She had expected the anger to come early and leave early, the hot, immediate kind that burns fast. But the anger that arrived in September was different. It was cold and clear and specific. It was anger at what had been taken from her, not just by Daniel, but by her own willingness to shrink herself into a shape that fit someone else's narrative. She had been complicit in her own disappearance long before she drove north on the gravel road. This was the hardest thought. The one she sat with the longest. She did not resolve it. Some thoughts are not problems to be solved. They are weights to be carried until carrying them becomes strength. In October, 10 months after she'd arrived, she was clearing dead cedar from the southern edge of the quarry, physical work she'd taken on herself as part of the ecological restoration plan she'd begun to implement on the property, when she found something. She almost missed it. It was half buried under decades of accumulated leaf litter and fallen limestone, a small wooden box, the kind you'd find in a craft store, but old, the wood gone silver and soft with age. Inside it, a field journal. Rosalind's handwriting, unmistakably, the same looping, confident script that had addressed birthday cards and recipe notes and the occasional fierce letter throughout Mara's childhood. She sat down on the quarry's edge, her legs dangling over the drop to the water, and read. The journal covered, apparently, a series of visits Rosalind had made to the property in the years after the second husband, Thomas, had died. The dates were from the late 1990s. Mara had been a child then, too young to understand her grandmother's grief, or even to recognize it as grief. Rosalind had always seemed simply Rosalind. Too solid and specific a person to be subject to ordinary suffering. But the journal told a different story. It told the story of a woman who had come to this quarry, this specific place, this wound in the earth, because she could not manage her grief anywhere that people could see her managing it. It told the story of a woman who had sat on this same edge, watching the same color changes in the same water, writing not about Thomas but about herself. About who she'd been before him, and who she intended to become after. There was a passage near the end of the journal, the last entry, dated a Sunday in November of 1999, that Mara read 3 times before she looked up. The quarry has been teaching me something I should have known by now. A wound this size, left alone, becomes its own ecosystem. The damage doesn't go away. It doesn't fill in. It becomes the thing. The depth is not a deficiency. It's what makes room for the water. You cannot have a quarry lake without the quarrying. You cannot have this particular beauty without this particular destruction. I have been trying to become who I was before. I am beginning to understand that this is the wrong ambition entirely. Mara sat with that for a long time. The quarry below her was going copper in the afternoon light. A cedar waxwing landed on a limestone ledge 3 feet away, regarded her with brilliant, indifferent composure, and flew off. She thought about Rosalind choosing this place. She thought about herself, months later, choosing the same place. Guided by the same dim pull of a childhood memory, not knowing that her grandmother had already mapped this particular territory of grief, had already made these specific discoveries. Had left them here in a box under the cedars like a message in a bottle dropped for a specific reader. She had not come here randomly. She had been sent. The discovery that changes everything. 2 days after finding the journal, a car appeared at the cattle gate. She heard it before she saw it, the crunch of gravel she'd learned to distinguish from wildlife noise, too regular, too weighted. She set down her tools and walked to the edge of the property line, and she recognized the car immediately. It was a silver sedan, slightly newer than she remembered, but the same make, the same quiet, considered color that matched its owner's preference for things that didn't call attention to themselves. Daniel. He got out of the car slowly. He looked different, older in a way that wasn't simply calendar time, his face carrying something she hadn't seen there before. She couldn't name it immediately. She stood 20 feet away and let the distance stay between them. "Your mother told me you were here," he said. She told me what I did. I mean, she told me that she knew what I did. That everyone knows." Mara said nothing. "I'm not here to," he stopped. Started again. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I want to be clear about that." She crossed her arms. "Then why are you here?" He looked at the quarry behind her, just the edge of it visible from where he stood, the drop into blue-green water. "I wanted to see if you were okay." You drove 2 hours to check on me. Yes. She looked at him for a long time. He was not, she decided, performing this. There was something in his posture, a collapse somewhere in the spine. The particular geometry of a person carrying actual weight, that was different from the careful performances she had catalogued over 3 years of marriage. But she also knew that she had been wrong about him before. Specifically and expensively wrong. I'm okay, she said. I'm more okay than you can probably imagine. I can see that, he said quietly. He was looking at her, not the quarry. You look different. I am different. A silence. The wind moved through the cedars. Somewhere below, in the quarry water, something rippled. I'm in therapy, he said. I've been, they have a name for what I do. Did, to people. He didn't say the name. It didn't matter. She knew what it was. She'd read the name in a book she'd borrowed from the town library, alone in the cabin at 11 p.m., recognizing each paragraph like a room she'd lived in. She had expected this moment to feel like many things. Vindication. Rage. The complex satisfaction of being seen and acknowledged after so long of being disbelieved. What it actually felt like was, very small. Not insignificant. Just small. The way something looks when you've moved far enough away from it to see its actual size. I'm glad you're in therapy, she said, and meant it, the way you mean it when you say it about someone you've stopped loving but haven't stopped wishing a reasonable life for. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, he said. Good, she said. That's not something I'm prepared to give you today. Maybe not ever. That's mine to decide on my own timeline. He nodded. He looked down at the gravel. You should go, she said. Not cruelly. The way you say it when it's simply true. He went. She watched the car back up the gravel road and disappear around the cedar bend, and she stood there until the sound of it faded completely, and then she walked back to the quarry's edge and sat down. She thought about what it meant that he had come. Not in terms of him, his motivations, his therapy, his whatever came next. But in terms of her. She had stood in front of the man who had dismantled 3 years of her life. Who had taken her reputation and her work and her professional community and her friendships and her sense of her own judgment, she had stood in front of him. On land that she had repaired with her own hands, with her grandmother's words in her back pocket, and she had been fine. Not performing fine. Not surviving fine. Actually, structurally, fundamentally fine. That was the measurement. Not his admission, not his therapy, not his guilt. Her own steadiness. The fact that seeing him had not reopened the wound but had simply confirmed what she already knew, the wound was there, and it had become something. She pulled out Rosalind's journal and read the last entry one more time. You cannot have this particular beauty without this particular destruction. She closed the journal carefully. She set it on the limestone beside her. Below, the quarry water held the autumn sky, pale blue, high clouds moving, the first suggestion of something changing in the light. Mara stayed at the cabin through winter. She did not stay forever. That was never the point. By the following spring, she had a partial commission from the conservation nonprofit, a developing professional relationship with Dr. Carrasco's research group, and the beginning of a plan to return to the city part-time, not to rebuild what she'd lost, but to build something different. Something smaller, more deliberately constructed, made of materials she'd chosen rather than materials she'd inherited by default. She took Rosalind's journal with her when she finally drove south again. She kept it on her desk, not as a relic or a comfort object, but as a working document. She read from it occasionally when the doubt crept in, which it still did, because doubt is not a problem that disappears with sufficient healing. It is a condition of being human and paying attention. What she had learned in that quarry cabin, through pump repairs and roof patches and months of silence and a grandmother's posthumous letter and one brief Clear conversation with the man who had tried to erase her, was not a lesson she could have learned any other way. You cannot excavate the depth from a life and then complain about the hollow. The hollow is what holds the water. The water is where the world comes to see itself reflected. She had been quarried. She had been left. She had become, in the years of patient abandonment, something that could hold still water and cedar sky and the weight of a bird landing on its edge. She had become the quarry. And here is the question the story leaves behind, the one worth sitting with: how many of us have been standing at the edge of our own excavation, the thing that was taken from us? The wound that refuses to fill in, waiting for it to return to what it was before, when all along, it's been quietly, patiently becoming the most beautiful place we've ever lived?